All right, the way that I want to approach this is much of the material that's in chapter, I think it's 6, is hard to read. So I went over yesterday in the afternoon. I had some time. My class had lab for part of the period. So I went over W3Schools, their thing over here that's on JS, HTML, DOM right here. So I want to spend 10 or 15 minutes or so going over that. All right. Now, the other thing I want to mention is you may or may not be aware of this, but someplace in here, I don't know where it is. It might be down at the bottom, but there's a thing in there that says exercises. All right. I should have pointed this out to you earlier in the semester. I didn't. But if you look here, notice there's exercises on virtually everything there is in JavaScript. There's exercises. All right, including what we're about to go over, which is the DOM. Now, there's not a boatload of them, all right, but they probably would be worth your time to go and run them, and there is a hide answer and there is a show answer, all right? So I left that incomplete there just because I want to see what they put, and that's what they had. Now, I'm not saying this is going to make you an expert, but it would probably at least get you thinking in the right way. All right? So with that said, I want to go over, as mentioned here, what's in here. So this section, again, the DOM stands for Document Object Model. There's really probably, I don't know, a good 3 things for you to really be able to understand and program things and kind of put together JavaScript and HTML and CSS. All right? One of those things we've talked about already is the box model. The fact that everything's in a box. And going along with that, anything that's in a box that you either put an ID or you put a class on, or if it's some kind of an element, you can put any kind of CSS in there you want. The other one we've gone over also, or another one that we've gone over also, is responsive design. All right? And whether you use Flexbox, whether you use media queries, you know, whether you use grid or a combination of all 3 of those, that's going to allow you, as your page shrinks and grows, all right? And one of the things that I'll be looking for then when you are doing that midterm is that your page is responsive. All right? And the third one is what we're going to talk about right now. So it's the HTML DOM. So the DOM kind of looks like this. Now, when I say it looks like this is an artist's rendition. First of all, for lack of better words, the DOM isn't real. It's something that gets created for you in the background when you set up a program. Does that make sense? But it's not like you can touch it. It's not tangible, in other words. All right? But at the top is your document. Under that is your HTML. Under your HTML is your head and your body. And I'm not going to keep going, but there's elements underneath there. And believe it or not, even though it doesn't look like it here, they're making this more simplistic than it actually is. It may not look simplistic to you right now, but there's more to it than that. If you put a blank line, technically the DOM accounts for blank lines. If you put in a comment, the DOM basically accounts for comments. So what it is basically it's taking, as it says there, it's a tree of objects. Again, it's the document object model. Virtually everybody just calls it the DOM. All right, so if we look here, it says within this, JavaScript gets the power it needs to create dynamic HTML. This is what we're getting to now. The fact is what we want to be able to do, and you've started doing it on your last test. And I don't remember, Nicholas, if this was the question that you had asked me or not, but right now, for example, for that movie question, right, you were just, and people did it different ways, but 3 movies, correct? What if you wanted to do more than that? You know, as time goes on, you'll probably like more than 3 movies. And how can you do that? All right? this is one way. All right, we're going to start looking at all this stuff. So as it says, JavaScript can change all of the HTML elements on the page. What are the HTML elements? Well, not just the HTML head and body tag, but any HTML element, an H1 tag, a paragraph tag, a UL, a LI, etc. All right? JavaScript can change all of the attributes in the page. Now, there's a difference. All right? So if I put in an anchor tag and I say href equals, and I put in double quotes, https://rankin.edu, the tag itself, the element is the anchor tag. The attribute is the address for Rankin. So what they're saying is you can change one or both. Next, you can change the styles on a page. You're going to see some examples in here of using JavaScript not to write CSS, but to basically invoke CSS. All right? Why? Well, one way that you might want to do something like that, as an example, we've talked about stuff like this before, but let's think about the miles per gallon program. All right? And if you put in a value that's either non-numeric or out of range, you might want a message to pop up on the right of the value you're trying to put something into, or below it or above it, that says what they did wrong. All right? Next, JavaScript can remove existing elements and attributes. So again, you can bring them in, you can remove them, you can modify them. And that's what they're talking about in here. Now, one of the things that we talk about in the third semester is we talk about the word CRUD. I mean the word CRUD. CRUD's an acronym that stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. The reason I'm bringing that up is you can do all those operations, all right, using the DOM. So you can create new stuff, you can read existing stuff, you can update existing stuff, and you can delete existing stuff. You can use this to write to a web page, write to something, anywhere on a web page, etc. All right. It says you can react to all existing HTML events on the page. You've already started doing some of this with your event listeners and the like. All right. And you can create new events on a page. So maybe you want to put something new on a page and you want to put a button underneath it. So when you click that button, something magical happens. All right, as an example. So in this section, that's what they say you're going to learn. I'm not going to read it to you. All right. So again, notice it's a standard. It is the way to access documents. Now, if you want to get, basically, if you look in here, they talk about the core DOM, the XML DOM, and the HTML DOM. All right? What's the difference? The core DOM covers both the XML DOM and the HTML DOM. I probably have given you this little shtick before, but years ago, and I think it was in around the late 90s, all right, people said that we don't want any more stinking HTML. We just want to replace it with something. That replacement was going to be XML. So HTML, the hypertext markup language, was going to be replaced with XML, the extensible markup language. The main difference between those is with XML, you make your own tags. HTML has got about 100 to 125 tags, some of which have been deprecated, and they're all used in a certain way. XML, you make your own tags. You can do whatever with them you want. Well, we're going to be concentrating just on the HTML DOM. We're not going to concentrate on the XML DOM. We're not going to concentrate on the core DOM. All right? So as it says, come on. So it says the HTML DOM is a standard object model and programming interface. So it defines the stuff that's shown in there. When we get to the end of this book, or near the end of this book, I think the last chapter is like 17 or whatever, but it's a chapter or two before the end. We'll talk about object-oriented JavaScript. All right? Normally, when we were running this course as 40 days of CSS and HTML and 40 days of JavaScript. We didn't get into that. But it's important you're at least exposed to that, because much of the work that you do in the third semester class, the AWD 1111 class that you'll take next fall, all right, uses object-oriented JavaScript. All right. It says it's the standard for how to get, add, change, and delete document or elements. Yeah, I agree with that. So, right that way. Okay, it's going to hang. Well, my whole, there it is. Okay. All right, so the next thing is on DOM methods. And you do have to understand the difference between a method and a property. We've talked about these before. I said that if I were to create a class and call it human beings, and then I made an object of that class and I called it Mason, and then I made another one and I called it Michael, they would have things in common. Height, weight, eye color, hair color, the values could be different, but they would have things in common. Those are their properties. Their behaviors are their methods. Eating, drinking, sleeping, etc. All right? So as it says, the HTML DOM can be accessed with JavaScript as well as other programming languages, but by far, I believe, JavaScript is the most popular. Again, all elements are defined as objects. An object is an instance of a class, and a class is a blueprint. All right? So there's the properties, and there's the methods. So properties basically are values. Methods are basically behaviors or actions. So they've got an example here. Now, you may have seen something like this before. You may not have. But let's just look at the JavaScript that's smack dab in the middle right here. All right? We looked at that document.query selector before. Document.query selector and getElementById virtually work in the same way. All right? Query selector is a little more powerful because you can search for either an ID or a class, but getElementId is searching by ID. That should make sense using the name. All right? And people think, yeah, you know, once we learn this stuff, I won't forget how to do this. I had a student yesterday in the afternoon class who was having a problem, and they had a line of code, not this, but it was sort of similar, and they had ID, and the I was capitalized, and so was the D. And they just looked right past it, because we're used to saying ID, capital I, capital D, but it has to be lowercase. So what this is saying is, go to the, basically, go to the HTML and find something with an ID of demo. And write to that, hello world. Well, you might look at that and go, that doesn't make sense. It will make sense if you look at it in one of these two ways. That if I came through here and I created a paragraph and I said ID equals demo and I put nothing in it, or I created a div and I said ID equal demo and I ended that. That's how you use this, because that's allowing you to write either to a div or to a paragraph this text. Does that make sense? All right. And again, you can put that anywhere on a page you want, right? Because you can put a paragraph or a div any place you want, on a web page. So I'm not going to go through that example because at least, hopefully to you, it makes sense. But if it doesn't, go run the example then. So, getElementById is the method. Inner HTML is a property. We are setting its property. There are other ways of doing it rather than just inner HTML, but it's a very popular way of doing it. All right? So they explain each one here. As it says, the most common way to access elements. That assumes that if you want to access that element using getElementById, and this shouldn't be a surprise, you've given that element an ID. Okay? Now, just so you know, there's also, we're going to get to it in just a minute, but there's for example, there's getElements by tag name, And there's another one that's get elements by class name. Typically, if you're going to go to the trouble of making something a class, you're going to have several of them in a document. That's why it's a class, right? If it has to be unique, it's an ID. So notice the pluralized here, elements, elements, element. All right? There's other ways of doing it, but these are three of the more popular ones. So by tag name, if I wanted all paragraphs. So why would you use tag name as opposed to class name? Remember, class, I can give, for example, both a div and a paragraph. I can give them both the same class. There's nothing wrong with doing that. I could take an unordered list and give it that class. Well, if I say by class name, it's going to return all three of those. If I say by tag name and I say paragraph, it'll only return the paragraph. As it says on the bottom there, the inner HTML property can be used to change any element, including the HTML tag itself and the body. All right? So they're just going to be going through a whole bunch of this stuff. So here are the ones I just mentioned to you. All right? And they give you examples of what you can do to change the values of those elements. The problem with this, if you'd call it that, is there's so much to comprehend. That's why I decided to go through this first, because unlike our book, most of the examples that are in here are really intuitive and they're fairly simplistic examples. At least you get to see them in a more simplistic way, because some of the ones that are in the chapter are more complex. So again, changing elements, adding and deleting elements. And notice in here, remove child. All right, we're using the word child in there. Yeah. They're all, everything that you put in the DOM basically goes in as a child, other than, HTML that's up at the top, basically. The body element has children. The head element has children. All right? And, well, you've already seen some of this. We've already started working with these event handlers. All right? Now, some of you made extensive use of event handlers on the test. Some of you did not. All right? So again, tomorrow I'm just going to show you what I did. All right? And I don't think anybody did it exactly the way that I did it. All right? Some people went really nuts, James. But I actually like what you did. It was pretty cool, to be honest with you. All right? But mine, when I write a key, I don't try to see how fast I can get it done, but I don't spend a lot of time on it. I used to tell students, I remember I taught a C programming class once, and there was a guy in the class, he was in a wheelchair. And the other reason I tell you that is he was out drinking one night with friends, and they got into a van and they didn't shut the back door. And he went flying out of it. All right? But he was a great guy, Joe. Just a super good guy. But he took a test with me, and the class was 8 in the morning till noon. Kind of like this one, but it only met twice a week. So one day they had 4 hours to do their test. And the next day I gave it back, and he passed, but he didn't do that great on it. And he said, there's no way that this test was possible for somebody to do in 4 hours. I thought it was very unfair. Well, and that's a fair thing to say. And I said, okay. And he said, well, how do you determine how much to put on a test? And I say, well, I look at it this way, that if I can basically do it in 5 minutes, you should be able to do it in 4 hours. He started laughing, and he said, you can't do this in 5 minutes. I said, okay, somebody tell me when to go. So we did that. And it was really close, but by about 4 seconds, I got it done. Now, it wasn't that hard. I'd already written it, but I didn't have anything in front of me. I just did it. All right? Well, again, when you're working with this stuff, there's always a multiple number of ways of doing the same thing. And that's good. All right? And guess what? It gets even more so. When you take the AWD 1111 class next fall, all right, we use a package that's called Express, And if you go out and look at its website, the first thing it says is it's unopinionated, which means there's literally an infinite number of ways of doing the same thing. It's saying, hey, I'll teach you the basics. You do it whatever the heck way you want. And a lot of this is the same way. All right. All right. So here's finding. So notice it's document dot. And you notice where they say obsolete or deprecated. Again, it just means you shouldn't be using those anymore. All right. But I'm not going to go through these. There's just way too many. But those are working with the document. And then we've got elements. All right. So notice here. Now what we're doing here is rather than setting something by ID, we're going out there and grabbing it and setting it equal to. You've seen this kind of stuff before. In fact, we did this with the constant, the dollar sign. Remember we said the dollar sign and then like ID or whatever you wanted to put in the parens. We'd say equals, and it was the query selector type of thing. Well, you can do the same thing with get element by ID if you want to. All right. So here's an example. I already mentioned some of these. Get elements by tag name. And basically, as it says, it'll find all the paragraph elements that are inside of main. All right. Why would you want all the paragraph elements? Maybe you've decided that on a web page, you just want paragraph text to be a different color or a different font or whatever. All right. And you might look at that and go, can't you just do that with CSS? And the answer is yes. But CSS basically is not an interactive mechanism. JavaScript is. So when you want to change something, be it color, be it size, be it something else, while the program's running, you're going to be doing it literally using JavaScript in one form or another. So again, this was by tag name. All right, and this is by class name. It's very similar. This is by selector. So notice we talked about query selector, which finds just the first one. There's a query selector all that finds everyone. All right. So if I wanted to find all paragraphs, this would be one way that I could do it. All right. And they're even showing, yeah, there's a bunch of other ones. Now, notice, I'm not going to run through these now, but I think it'd be worth your while to go through these. And if you go, I have absolutely no idea what they're even talking about, then give it a guess. And if you get it wrong, they're not keeping track. All right? But when you say submit answer, all right, there's a show answer there. So if you don't know how to do something, just submit it and show it to look at it. This might be something that you find helpful next week when you're taking your test on 5, 6, and 7. Geez, I don't know how to do that. Well, then this is a place that you can go to at least look something up. All right? All right, changing HTML. Some of this we've talked about already. Again, there's the inner HTML. We already went through an example like this before. So we've set up a paragraph. Notice there's existing text in it. That's okay. So when we run this, it should say hello world. That makes sense. All right. Come on. Oh, they already changed it. Okay. So it was hello world originally, so in fact, if I come in there, comment out that line, it's got hello world. But here it's saying, okay, I want you to go in there and grab whatever that paragraph was, and no, could we do this? Think this will work? What do you think that'll say?
World new text.
Let's see. All right. So that's totally legit to do something like that. But hopefully what that means is what you start to look at and think about in here is, wow, now I can change something. You've probably been out to a site where they might ask you, you know, What kind of background do you want? Be it a color or whatever. What do you want for your avatar type of thing? Isn't all that stuff interactive? All right. And I'm not saying that's the only way to do it, but it's a very popular way of doing that is to do it through JavaScript. All right, so here they changed the value of an attribute. So notice here the source was smiley.gif, and they're changing it to landscape. So again, if we come in here, we'll see there's the landscape, but if we comment that out and we run it, there's this smiley face. All right? And again, none of this stuff is like, you don't become an expert by just running these examples, but the idea is if you run through these examples, hopefully it'll make sense on how you can do it. All right? All right. You can use JavaScript to create dynamic content. You may or may not remember this, but we did kind of look at an example of this. I don't know if we wrote it or it was one I showed you, but I had a thing where when you change the size of the window and you click the button, it showed you the current screen dimensions. That's interactive, isn't it? So if I run this, this is just going to show the current date and time, right? No biggie there, but notice if I run it again, see how the seconds have changed? All right. So again, the idea is this is interactive. Oops. I don't know. I hope I didn't close that. I didn't. Good. All right. The document.write we've looked at already. This is no biggie. All right. So this should actually say what on the screen? Blah, 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 then the date, then blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. And you can see where it wrote it. And again, if I go in, you'll see how that's changing. 17, 20, etc. All right, and again, there's more exercises on here. Most of them are very repetitious from the stuff that we just looked at. All right? All right, working with forms. This is a big one. Form validation. We have actually looked at some types of form validation. We started out, you may remember this, with no validation whatsoever. We didn't put anything in there. And then you came in and, for example, if you create an input field in HTML and you say its type is number, now it's got to be numeric or blank, right? All right. Then we looked at the word required, all right, which basically does just that. It says that something is required. Well, look what they're doing here. They're saying, and this looks really ugly, don't worry about what this means. I'll tell it to you. This says that we've got a form that's called my form. All right? And my form has got a field in it that's called fname, for first name probably. And that's got a value. All right? So we let x equal that value. Again, I would have used triple equals here, but if it's equal to nothing, you say name must be filled out. All right? Now, typically in here, we've done stuff before where you input something, and as long as you keep inputting bad stuff, boom, 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 you get stuck in there. Well, a lot of times in here, you're not going to put that into a loop. It's very easy to confuse a person who's just an end user who doesn't know any of this stuff by putting them into a loop. All right? So instead, you typically would give them a nice message and ask them to do it again. All right? All right. So, let's see. Notice on submit. What this means is when you click the submit button, all right, call validate form. If validate form returns true, you will submit it to a server. If it returns false, you're going to keep them where they are. And I think I've said this to you before, but I'm going to say it again anyway, and that is typically the way that you perform form validation is you validate on the client side, you send it out to the server, and the server runs almost the same checks you just did. Just in case you've got JavaScript turned off, or you're somebody malicious who's trying to do something you shouldn't be doing. All right. There's numeric input. All right. So what does that mean? Well, there's nothing in there. Put nothing in there. Not valid. Not valid. Now, if I put in and hit, notice I'm still getting not valid. Technically, unless you run trim on it, all right, that is not a valid field. But if I come back in here and I remove all of those, this is asking between 1 and 10. So let's try that. How about 2? And then hit space a bunch of times. Oh, they did take that. So they must have either run trim or they're only checking for that. But notice if you put in a value that's less than 1 or is greater than 10, it's invalid. All right? And if we look at the text or the code that's in here, well, this is a regular function. This is a function declaration, not a function expression. So X is that number that you're putting in here. All right? Input ID equal num. That right there is this. Make sense? All right? And if it's not a number, or it's less than 1, or it's greater than 10, you say input was not valid. Otherwise, you say input okay. Boom. All right? And you're taking that, okay, that text, and then you're writing it out here. That's what that line is doing. Does that all make sense? I'm not trying to make it too simple or too hard. I'm just trying to explain what's going on, so when you see the stuff in the actual book, it makes some more sense to you. All right? Automatic form evaluation says it can be performed automatically by the browser. We've already seen that with the word required. All right? There's all sorts of validation you can do. What they mention here, what I've already said. You validate on the client. Once it suffices to the client, you send it to the server. The server can still reject it, but the chances of the server rejecting it if the client has validated it are very slim. All right? Unless they're making different checks. Constraint validation, some of these we've looked at already. I'm not going to read the list to you, but like the max and the min are for number fields, right? We've looked at that already. Now, there's some other things in here. We've done some work with pseudo selectors before, you might remember. We used like hover, stuff like that. This is different things, for, as it says, they're pseudo selectors. All right? Only select stuff that's disabled. Grab everything that's invalid. This is stuff that you could use in conjunction with form validation. The more information that you can provide to someone who's filling out a form when they screw it up, the better the chance is that they're not going to screw it up after that. All right? But if somebody does something wrong and all you do is show them a red asterisk, they probably have no idea what that means. All right? All right. CSS. So notice what we can do. We can tell it, get element by ID dot style dot property. So what are we doing? We're telling it to take and turn that particular paragraph, or the element with an ID of P2, we're telling it to turn it green, or blue rather. You can look at that and say, wait a minute, you told us before that we shouldn't actually write stuff like that. All right? Remember, there were 3 ways that we could add CSS. This is more like inline, which I said is the worst way of doing it. But if you are creating something interactively, quite often that's going to be the way that it's done. All right? All right. Events then. This is another one with get element by ID. I'm not sure why they're using that one, but they're just changing it red to red. So again, when you click it, that's all that happens. But again, you could put that code in that button that was checking form fields. All right? And you could have it go through all the fields, and any one that it found that was invalid, you could turn what was in there red. You could put a message to the side that was red, whatever. All right? And as it says, there's some more exercises, and there's some more examples in here. All right? All right, let's jump in then to animations. Now, some of the stuff that they're going to show in here is almost, for lack of better words, going to look silly, because some of the animation that you do with this is really simplistic. All right? And there's other ways to do animation. One of the nice things, and one of the reasons that a lot of sites still use jQuery, is the fact that jQuery is really good with animation. All right? There's a lot of stuff you can do with jQuery. I'll show you some of that next week. All right? But there's an animation container. Yeah, my animation will go there. Well, big deal. So they're setting this thing up. I don't even know if they're doing anything with it. So there you go. And you run it. Right now it's not doing anything. But the idea is you can make it move around on the screen. All right? That's why I said a lot of the stuff that's done with this, as far as animation, there's the code. It's going to look pretty simplistic. Okay? This does give me a chance, though, to mention to you, just so you've seen, heard this, etc. Notice in here they talk about intervals. Now, I realize I'm older than probably any two of you put together, all right? But that said, all right, does everybody remember the days, and if I mentioned this already, sorry, of the old-fashioned alarm clock? You'd wind, it's a round thing, you'd wind it up and back, you'd pull a little knob out, and then it would go off and you hit it and it would stop. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, that's a timer, right? Basically that's what it is. On the other hand, fast forward, I remember I used to work with this guy named Keith, and we were talking one day, a guy we were working with was getting married, and we were all getting invited to his wedding. And I said, what are you getting him? He said, anytime I go to a wedding, I give him a clock radio. People always can use a clock radio. Okay, that's fine. But the idea with a clock radio or an alarm, those alarms today, is like my alarm is set every day for 5. And I don't do this, but if I wanted to, instead of turning it off, I could hit snooze, right? And then it would go off again probably around 5:10. You could typically do that. Those are intervals. So when it talks about intervals in here, they're talking about typically working with timers, all right, to have something happen. It used to be in older types of word processing packages, if you didn't save every 10 minutes or so, you'd see a message on the bottom of the screen that would say WordPerfect has auto-saved your document. All right? All right. So they put those together, and they give you something like this. See that? Now, it's not gee whiz. All right? And I've said this to you on more than one occasion, and that is, don't ever let the medium, what you're doing here, all right, don't ever let it be overthrown by putting in stuff that's not needed. All right, I could see if you were trying to display something for somebody and tried to give them a demo, that would make a lot of sense. All right, but on most web pages, I don't see what that's going to buy you. The key takeaway though is you've got CSS here, and you've got the JavaScript that's making it happen. Now you could set it up. For example, you could have four buttons or more. I've often had people do that. You'll have a button here that'll say left, right, up, or down type of thing. And you could move it by clicking each time and make it move a certain number of pixels or whatever, if you wanted to do that. All right, events. Not simple, but look at this. Notice what happens when I take my mouse rather have a mouse in and a mouse out event. That makes sense to everybody? There's my mouse in. Watch the mouse over me. See that? There's the mouse in, mouse out, mouse in, mouse out. A mouse also has a click event. As it says, click me. Click me again. So you can see what happens when you do that. Now this one isn't going to do it. It had goodbye, then it left. All right. But that's it. This one, I can keep mousing over it as long as I want to. And again, one of the things that we'll talk about next week with jQuery is jQuery also supports this stuff. It used to be that this was darn near impossible to do with what's called vanilla JavaScript, which means just doing it in JavaScript. But now it's not nearly as difficult anymore. That's one of the reasons that the popularity of jQuery has been waning over the years. All right? So, There are some examples of what you can react to. I'm not going to read any of them to you, but it's most everything that would typically happen on a web page. All right? And they've got some examples here. All right, notice, click on this text. All right, so we've changed it. Now, again, some of the examples, like I mentioned here, are kind of contrived, but the idea is hopefully this is a thing that you can go back to next week if you take when you take your test, if you have got a question on how to do something. All right? All right. So notice what we've got here. This is the old-fashioned way of doing it, just so you know. When you declare a button, this is not, we're not registering it like we've been doing with the on-click, etc. No, what we're saying is when you click the button, this is put right into your HTML. This is not an event listener per se, like we've been doing. This is literally saying, hey, there's a button. When you click it, call that. That's more the old-fashioned way of doing it. In fact, when I wrote the original test, I did that at least on one of the questions, just so you could see it. All right. So it says, the DOM allows you to assign events to elements using JavaScript. All right. So notice what we're doing is we're adding this display date to the button. So after we do that, it's what you'd guess. Click it, you get the date. All right. But again, you have the ability now by using the DOM to not only do that, but to create the button in the first place and put it on the screen. And maybe, you know, this kind of thing. All right, you know, we had the thing on the test, right, with enter your age. You could go into that venue or not go into the venue. Well, maybe, all right, and I realize this wouldn't probably work very well, but, you know, maybe we had content in there that was for adults. So we asked the person their age. And if they were honest and they said 16, we wouldn't show them that content. And if they said 22, we would show them the content. So we could actually either hide the content and then provide it, or just literally bring it in based on how they answered that question. All right. Now, there's an onload and an unload event, as it says. They're triggered when the user either enters a page or leaves a page. All right. And there's all sorts of things that you can do in there. Now, they talk here about check cookies. Don't even worry about it, but just so you hear the term. All right. What a cookie is basically it's a text file that a server writes to a client. All right. For instance, if I go out, this isn't a great example, but it's the one I'll use. If I go out to Amazon and I'm looking for a book on JavaScript, let's just say. So I go look through a whole bunch of books, and let's say, oh, that one's good, I buy it. There's a good chance that the next time I come out to Amazon, they're going to show that picture of that book, and then underneath it, it'll say something like, people who bought this book also looked at these books. Why? Because they're trying to sell me more, right? All right. And it's some kind of a cookie has been written back from the server to my browser that allows them to do that. All right. There's an on-change event, as it says. You can use that in combination with input fields. If you wanted to make something look, so if they put in all lowercase on their form, and you wanted to use either title case or uppercase, that's what they're showing here. The mouse out and the mouse over I've already shown you. All right, but notice mouse over me. All right, the mouse down, mouse up, and click events. So there's a whole bunch of these. All right. We'll finish this and we'll take a break. The add event listener, already mentioned this. Not only can you add a button, but you can add an event listener to that button. You can literally add, for example, a click event. You can add a click event to a paragraph, to a sentence, to a div, to anything in the world you want. I would not recommend adding like a click event to words on a page. I would put those words in a paragraph or in a div, and I would add the click event to the paragraph or to the div. To me, that just makes more sense to do that. All right? All right, so there's an add event listener. There's also a remove event listener. All right? So they're showing here, it says you can add it to an element. Now, what they're doing here, this is a little different. I mentioned this, but Notice they're adding an event listener to the element. It's a click event, but what they're doing is they're saying, okay, when you click it, immediately run that. You see how they're not calling another function? All right. They're literally saying, all right, function alert. And what you'll notice when we get to the end of the semester is you can also, it looks weird, but right here, you can put two parens in. And if you put two parens in, it's called an IFI. It's an immediately invocable function expression. Because if you put the parens there, it means not only am I setting this up, but do it. This right here, the way they've got it without the parens, just says when you click it, you should call this and do this. This, if you put the parens there, means actually do it. All right. And again, more examples. All right. You can add more than one event handler to the same element. To my knowledge, years ago, you couldn't do this. You could only add, for your elements, only add one event handler. That's why things like jQuery became really popular. All right, because you can do what's called chaining to add a whole bunch of stuff in there. Yeah, you can add it to the window. You can pass things in. This is a little confusing, but let's just take a minute or two literally to go over it. All right, and bubbling and capturing. Okay, would you all agree that, you know, let's just say that, I don't know, they always use champagne as an example, but if they've got bubbles that, stuff bubbles that bubbles up, you know what I'm talking about? All right. What that's saying is, let's assume here that I've got a function. This is just going to look really ugly, but I just want to show you this. I've got a function that's called F1, and F1 calls F2. All right, that's all it does. So I got my curly braces here and here. Now I've got a function called F2. All right, and that function calls F3. I'm going to just leave it at that. We'll write one more. So down here I'll have function F3. And it'll do some stuff. I don't care what it does, but it'll do something. The way that this works is with bubbling. If there's an error that's found right here in F3, if I don't have any error handling code for that, it jumps up to whatever calls it, which was F2. And if there's error handling code, it'll run that. If there's no error handling code there, it'll jump up to F1. And if there's error handling code there, it'll call it. If there isn't any, it'll go up. Usually you'll have like a function main at the top. And it'll go up to main. And if when it goes up to main, if it finds it, it'll call it. And if it doesn't, that's when it'll blow up. So stuff will bubble up. And that's what they're talking about. That wasn't the greatest, that wasn't the most artistic example. But just so at least you've heard that. So it says there's two ways of event propagation. It's the way of defining the element order when an event occurs. In bubbling, as it says, the innermost is handled first, and it works its way up. In capturing, it goes the other way. So that's the difference between the two of them. All right, like I mentioned before, not only can you add an event listener, you can remove an event listener. More exercises in here. I would tell you that if you can look at these exercises and they make sense, that should really help you a lot for the test. All right. All right, 4 more to go. Let's just jump through these quickly. DOM navigation, you want to be able to iterate your way through the DOM, right? All right, and that's what they're talking about here. Now, it says the nodes in the tree have a hierarchical relationship. So, as it says, these are both children. Since they're both children of this, they're siblings. Some people go nutso in here, and they talk about parents and grandparents and uncles and etc. That's a little ridiculous. All right, but typically, if you understand parent and child, that's going to be most of what you have to worry about. And they even show you this. I'm not going to read any of it to you. But take a look at this. You won't be asked to do anything like this, but you'll be asked to do stuff similar to what we've been looking at in this section. as it says, you can navigate between nodes. One child to another, child to parent, parent to child, etc. And there's some good stuff in here. All right? All right. It says there's two special properties that allow you to access the full document. Document.body, that's everything that's in your body tag. All right? And document.document element is not only what's in the body tag, but what's in the head tag as well. Typically, you're not going to want to use the DOM to manipulate stuff that's in the head tag. All right? But again, you could. The node name property, every time you add something to using the DOM, you're basically adding what's called a new node. All right? So there's the properties, etc., the stuff about nodes. I want to give this its due diligence. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to back up. All right? We're going to go through this again, not this second, but it is 10:06. It's a good time for a break. So let's take a break till 10:20. All right? And when we come back, I'm going to go through these last three sections, all right, and then we're going to go through the chapter. All right, so we probably won't spend all that much time on the chapter because we've hit the highlights by that time. All right? All right, it's a little bit early, but I'm gonna start back up. I want to finish this section, like I mentioned. We've gone through what you see here, and I was jumping into the navigation, but I was doing it quickly. So this is what a lot of the chapter in the book concentrates on. That's why I want to take a little bit of time to go over this, okay? As it says, with the HTML DOM, you can navigate through what's called the node tree. So all those things that we saw, those pictures, those were all nodes of the DOM. All right, that's the way that they're referred to. And as it says, there are relationships between nodes. So I'm not going to read these, but just take a look. Virtually everything that you see in here is one node or another. You will also notice that typically when you get down to the bottom where it says text there, can you see that in the pictures? Those are usually referred to as leaf nodes, L-E-A-F, meaning it doesn't go any further. Just like you've got branches and the branches have leaves, but the leaves don't really have anything, it's the same kind of an idea. All right? So as it says, with the HTML DOM, all nodes in the node tree can be accessed by JavaScript. So that's saying you can manipulate anything that's in here. You can also create nodes. You can modify existing nodes. You can delete existing nodes. All right, so here again are some of the relationships that they talk about. I'm going to leave that up there for a second and shut up because I'd like you to read that. It's kind of like we would think in a regular family. All right, and in fact, you may or may not be aware of this, but if I go in here and I bring up a DOS window, so I can bring up a command prompt like this. It says where I am by default. So it says I'm under users JP Scott. All right, and if I go, for example, and I say CD desktop, desktop, and I hit enter, now I'm at my desktop. Does that all make sense? But if I say this, CD/, now I'm at the root. I can't go up any higher than that. That's as though I went into the Windows Explorer and double-clicked on the C drive. Does that make sense to everybody? The reason that I'm telling you that not to waste my time or yours, but when they mention there the top node is the root, that's basically what they're talking about. It's the only one without a parent. And basically everything cascades down through the root. All right, the rest of it you can just read yourselves, okay? But then they show you the picture, and then they're showing it to you. What the root node is, all right, who the children are, who the children of those children are, etc. All right? So, kind of went through this quickly before, but as it says, you can use the following node properties to navigate between nodes. What does this mean? This means that if you click on one of these, all right, well, I thought they were hyperlinked, and maybe they're not. So let's take a look down here. A common error in DOM processing is to expect an element node to contain text. No, they don't always. All right, now what does it say here? It says the element node title does not contain text. It contains a text node, and that's its value. All right? The reason that that becomes important is you can change anything that's in a node immediately using JavaScript. And they give some examples in here, okay? All right, we've already talked about the inner HTML. So again, you've seen that already. It says we use the inner HTML property to retrieve the content of an element. Yeah. It says, however, learning other elements above is useful for understanding and being able, when you go up and down what's called the DOM tree, it's called either iterating through the DOM, all right, or running through the DOM, traversing the DOM. It goes in a lot of different things that it's called. We already mentioned this. Everything that's in here in the body, so everything that's there, you can use document.body for. But if you want to, notice there's no head tag here, but let's pretend for a minute there was. All right, so if we want to grab everything, including the HTML tags and the head tag, we can use the document.document element. And what's really not used very often. So when we look at this, notice we've got node name. What is it? That's the name of the node. I mean, that's pretty obvious, but take a look at what's in there. It's read-only, meaning once it's created, you don't change it. All right? It's the same as the tag name. All right? It says the node name of an attribute is the same as the attribute name, etc. So when you start iterating and working your way through this, all right? I mean, look at this. This looks kind of weird. This has got what? Here's the basically the node text, and I think you'd agree there's nothing in here in this example. And if we look at this and we click the button, if it comes up, and we run this, all right, what are we telling it to do? Well, we're telling it to basically go and put, where is it getting high from, or H1? Oh, we're telling it to grab that node name, so that H1, and we're telling it to put it into that paragraph. The example's contrived. It's not something you would typically do, but they're showing you how you could do something again. Node value property, as it says, is the value of a node, and there's more of these. All right? It says the most important properties are the ones that are shown there. So, nodes themselves, this is big stuff. If you want to be able to interactively add stuff to a page, all right, as it says, you can create new nodes. You can put them anywhere you want. You can replace what's there with something new. You can add something new to the bottom, to the top, or anywhere you want to put it. All right? So as it says, to add a new element to the DOM, you must create the element. Just creating it isn't enough. All right? Then, as it says, you must append it to something that already exists. That puts it on the page, so to speak. So you'll notice here they're creating it. So they're creating a new paragraph, And here they're coming in and they're adding it, they're appending it, rather, all right? And there's a bunch of examples. The explanation in here is better than what I just gave. So again, if you're looking through this, it's like none of this makes any flippin' sense. Go back and look at this and look at where they explain this stuff. I mean, I'm taking a good hour to go through this. That's how important I think it is. All right? So you can insert something before something else. You can remove something. All right? You can remove entire nodes. You can remove the content of a node or the node itself. All right? You can replace the content in a node. The get elements by tag name, which we talked about a little bit earlier, notice as it says, it returns an HTML collection. It's like an array in that you can do some traversing through it. But it's most like an array because you can access the different pieces by using an element number. So the first one you return would be element 0, etc. All right, and that's what they're saying in here. They have a length just like arrays have lengths. They're not an array. They even say that. It says it may look through an array or like an array, but it's not. It says you can loop through it, but you can't run methods that were set up specifically for arrays, like pop and push, etc. All right, and then finally they talk about node lists in here. As it says, a node list is a list or collections of nodes that you grab or extract from a document. I'm not going to read this. You can look through it all. But again, take some time and look at the examples. All right? This section is really good. The difference between a collection and a node list. And again, they mentioned the list is not an array. All right? Now that's it for this section. But again, as I said to you before, with virtually not everyone that's in here, but many of the things that are in here. So again, if I jump back to the forms, and I go down to the bottom, maybe that wasn't a good example, but many of these, you already saw this, have exercises. All right? You know, when people tell me, they go, well, I don't have time to do that. You know what? I get it. Either you make time or you don't do it. But if you don't do it and you take a test next week and you don't understand stuff, that would be the first question I'd ask. Did you run through this stuff on your own? All right, let me stop this.